Okay, this is the video for the final facial feature that we'll draw, and this is the second ear. So for this ear, we are drawing it from a different angle and perspective than we did ear number one. So we're actually looking at it from the side. So in order to start, I am going to start in the top area where we have the helix, which is the ridge of the upper portion of the ear. So looking at the photo, we're going to start with a line like this, and then it's just gently going to curve upward and around. So we're drawing just that outer side of the helix. So as you're drawing this, make sure you're using sketching lines, not just one single line, but multiple small lines. And when we get to about this point, what happens is we're going to have the formation of the earlobe. And so the angle and direction changes just a little bit. And one thing to notice too is that wherever you start with this line, I'm going to just sketch a vertical line just going straight down. So it's going to be parallel with the edge of the paper. And that line's could be important for a couple of different reasons. First, it's going to mark kind of the edge of the earlobe. So the placement of the edge portion of the earlobe is basically going to line up with where we started at the top. So we're just going to curve this earlobe a bit and leave it like that. Now, the next thing we're going to do, we're going to start by drawing the underneath portion of the helix. So I'm going to start about right here, just with a slight curved line like this. And then this is going to curve down just a little bit. It's going to curve up a small amount, and then it's going to widen back out. So still use your sketch lines. And then for the lower portion of the helix, this is going to narrow just a little. So we're just going to follow this outer curve that we started with. And then with this line, I'm just going to have it stop like that. And so we'll do the rest of this work with our tortillions once we get to that point. So we just have a couple more lines to draw. I'm going to come back up here at the top and finish out the helix where it leads into the leg of the helix in this area. So what happens is that this is going to curve outward just a little bit. And then this line is not going to go all the way here. So it's going to start its curve in this area. And so this is where we have the leg of the helix. And this is just going to stop like that. So that'll fade out also, kind of similar to this. So it's not going to connect to anything. Now, the next thing that we have, we're going to finish the leg of the helix. And so we're going to start it right here. And as it goes up, it's going to widen just a little bit. So what this is going to do, this is actually going to cross this line that we initially sketched just a little bit. Now we're going to have a go down a little. So this is going to cross that line, and then this is going to form the tragus. And so the very kind of farthest point or the apex of the tragus is going to be on this line. So this is going to be about here, and then we'll just connect it to this curve that we started. So with the tragus, it's going to curve down, and you're going to have kind of a curve that moves downward like this, and then it'll cross this line again. And then we're just going to let that stay. So with this shape or this line that we just drew, it kind of has this really odd, almost like the number three type design to it, where it just follows that kind of a strange curve. So the next portion we're going to draw, this is going to be the antihelix. So the antihelix is this piece of cartilage that's right underneath the helix being this part. And so for the antihelix, this is going to start here, and it's just going to kind of have a little bit of a curve. And then this is going to curve down. So when it curves down, it's essentially going to kind of follow this line. And then right when you get a little bit further past this point, it's going to change its direction. It's going to come up just a little bit. So this is the antitragus. So in the previous picture, the antitragus, or in the example picture, the antitragus was kind of pointed. This is a little more flat and rounded on this particular ear. And then this is just going to gently curve this way. So this area blends into the side of the face just a little bit, so that's why I didn't define this line too clearly. So those are the basic lines that we're working with this particular angle of the ear. So the next step I'm going to take, I am going to get my 6B pencil. And with my 6B, I'm going to go in and add all of my darkest values first. So underneath the helix right here, this is pretty dark. I'm not going to press real hard, but I want to apply enough pressure that I'm getting some of those dark values out of that. So we have the shadow that the helix creates. And then the shadow falls this way. So if we put this down, if we press too hard, it becomes maybe a little difficult to blend. So that's why I'm just putting enough pressure to get it dark, but I don't want to put so much pressure that it kind of distorts what we're trying to do. Next area that is really dark is in this region right above the tragus, right underneath the leg of the helix. And so for this area, we want to think about how the curve is formed. So I'm going to curve these values like this. So I'm starting this direction, and then I'm slowly going to work my way this way. And for this dark value, I'm going to go about this far and then start to curve these in. Put a little more pressure to get a little darker. And a few more areas left to put some darker areas of graphite. So one of these areas is underneath the helix on the very edge of the ear. So I'm just going to follow this line that I had initially sketched. And then I'm going to put a little bit of a value on the underneath portion of the earlobe, specifically in this location. And then I'm just going to put a little bit on the outside of the earlobe. We also have this really, really dark shadow behind the ear, but I'm going to come back later and add that. And I'm going to put just a little bit right on the top. So much like the first ear and the two noses, a lot of this feature is going to be made up with tonal shading. So using my tortillon, I'm going to come through and blend these values in. And what's going to be important for this is you really want to think about the direction. So what's happening in this portion of the ear, these values are curving down like this. And then when you get to this area, they start to change. And then these values start to curve up and over instead of curving in. So just one thing you want to take note of as you're drawing this. We do have a pretty bright highlight in this area, but there is a little bit of value kind of the lower portion of antitragus or the antihelix. So I'm going to curve these up like this. It's a really small mark, but I still want to curve it in that direction. And once we get to this part of the ear, these are going to start curving and wrapping this way. So the direction changes right about here. And we do have some pretty bright highlights right here. So if you get those a little too dark, you can just take your eraser and pull out those highlights again. And I'm going to blend the values right here. And so these values are curving this way because this portion sticks up. So it's almost like kind of leading up to a mound or a hill. And we do have a bit of a highlight right here, but I need to blend the values a little bit more clearly and smoothly. So that way we don't have that sharp line. So as you're drawing this ear, you're not going to have any geometric shapes. You're not going to have any hard, just straight lines on this feature. It's very, very organic. Lots of curved lines, lots of regular lines. The shapes in general are pretty irregular. So this shadow is a little too dark. Not a big deal. I can take my eraser and I'm just gonna kind of stipple my eraser in this area to kind of pick up some of that pencil or the graphite. Kind of bring that highlight back just a little. All right, with my tortillon, I'm now going to move into this area right above the leg of the helix. So this is pretty dark also. So I'm just going to blend this down. And then we're starting to see a lot of texture right here. So wherever you see that kind of dotted texture, just use your tortillon like you're going to stipple with it. So a lot of that texture starts to happen in this area. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to use some really brisk strokes with my tortillon. And then where we can see some of those darker, they almost look like dots. It's just simply the texture of the skin. I can take my tortillon and just stipple this, and I will get that same effect. So this is a pretty bright highlight, so we want to keep it pretty light. So as you get a little bit further down, just don't press as hard as you're making these stipple marks with your tortillon. Then we do have a darker, it's not super dark, but it's kind of a mid-tone right here. So these marks, they're going to curve up, and this will essentially kind of lead into the leg of the helix. And we have more of those highlights right here. So I just want to make sure I don't cover those up or get them too dark. They need to be pretty bright. And then I'm going to come back over here, right above the tragus, where it's a really dark shadow. But one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to just draw a dark circle right here or a dark kind of oblong shape. You want that to fade in to the rest of the inner portion of the ear. So I'm going to blend these values first. And if you're having trouble getting some of your pencil marks to blend together, remember if you just work in really small circular motions, that'll help blend that pencil together a lot better. Now, we may kind of see this as like a sharp, defined line of a shadow, but it's really not. It's kind of soft. So I'll take my tortillon and just go over part of it, part of that shadow. And then for this portion of the ear, these marks are going to curve. So these are going to curve up like this. So it looks concave. And then we do have some, highlight here, but we can also see more of that kind of stipple type texture. So I'm just going to use my tortillon again and just add stippling where it's still white. So this drawing is very similar to the first ear in that in order for it to be successful, you've got to have a pretty wide range of values. So you want all those really dark tones, you want your middle-ish tones, like what we see here, and then you want those really bright highlights. So that will make your drawing successful. For the next step, I'm going to work on the leg of the helix. So that is this area. So I'm just going to take my tortillon. I've got plenty of pencil still left on it. And I'm just going to add a little bit of value to that top portion and then to the bottom portion. So there is a little bit of a highlight on the leg of the helix. It's got some like brighter flecks of white in it, but for the most part, it's going to be kind of like a light gray. So think of this as a cylinder or almost tube-like. So you want to curve these also. And then right on the outer edge of the ear, so this would all be the side of the head. We've got some value in here. And then we see this highlight right on the edge of the tragus or the outer edge of the tragus. So the tragus does have some value on it. And then it kind of hits that highlight that is pretty bright. And then in this area, these lines are going to curve. So we're now talking about the area right above the leg of the helix. I'm going to curve these like this. And so this is now leading into that side of the head. And I'm going to put a little bit of value right here. And I'm just very lightly going to go over that highlight where the tragus is. Put a little more value underneath that curve. And then this area is going to blend into the earlobe. So with that earlobe shape, what's going to happen is these are going to curve down and it just blends into this earlobe that we drew. Now there's a little bit of a highlight on top, so I'm just going to skip that, leave that a little white or lighter. And I think I'm going to change my earlobe shape. It doesn't look entirely accurate. So I think it needs to be a little more round. All right, there we go. That looks a little better. So with the earlobe, just follow these outside lines for the direction that you're going to put your tortillon marks. And I have this area where I did add a little bit of pencil. So I'm going to pull this down so I can emphasize this dark shadow that's right here. And then this kind of creeps up a little bit in this space. Then it fades out just a little. And so where we stopped with this dark area, this essentially is just going to fade into this area. So I'm just using my tortillon and kind of pulling in these dark values into the earlobe. Now there are some highlights I need to bring back on the earlobe, but I'm going to come back and do those in a few minutes. First, I'm going to finish out the helix. So we still have all of the top portion of the helix to add value to. So for this area, these lines are going to curve like this. Sort of, they're going to form that almost like backwards letter C arc. So there's a little bit of a darkness right here, and then I'm going to start curving these up. And then with this area of the helix, they're going to curve also, but they're simply going to curve in the other direction. So I do have those pencil marks that I laid down a little bit ago, so I need to make sure that those get blended in all the way. So remember, if your tortillon isn't blending very well, you can use sandpaper and kind of scuff it up a little. You can also use like things like rough concrete. That also works pretty well. So now I'm going to start curving these tortillon marks. So I need to sand my tortillon just a little bit because some of those values weren't blending like I was wanting. And there are some highlights on this helix. I can make them a little bit brighter. I can take my eraser and just um, very lightly go over these. And as I do this, I'm going to try and curve these eraser marks just a little. So that'll help add to the effect. It'll help it look more rounded and cylindrical. Now, there's a few other things I can do. So, some of these areas are a little more defined. So, for example, um, this is pretty sharp line that we're seeing, and the line is defined by that shadow. So, after going over it with my tortillon, it softened it just a little bit. So, I'm just gonna use my tortillon or I'm going to use my pencil. So, I'm using my 6B pencil to bring back some of that sharpness. It just develops a little more clarity and definition. And I come up here and do the same. So as you're working, think about pressure also. How much pressure are you putting with your tortillon? How much are you applying with your pencil? It just so like right now, I'm just barely putting any pressure, but I want that appearance of the 6B pencil to fall on the paper. Then I'm going to define this area too. So this has kind of that sharper ridge to it along the helix. And I'm going to redefine this area above the tragus. And I'm going to darken that just a little bit. So remember, whenever you use your tortillon on an area that's pretty dark, it'll lighten it up just a little bit. So this part of the ear is really dark because it leads into that ear canal. So I'm just going to redefine it. And I think I'm going to bring just a little bit of definition back here. So I'm not going to press very hard at all. I'm just barely touching my pencil to the paper. And I think I'm going to push this value over just a little bit right here. And I think I'm going to darken this just slightly. So I'm going to use very, very light curved lines. I'm still using my 6B pencil, but I'm barely putting any pressure. So I'm applying these right on the antihelix. And in the photo, you can see these lines, and so that's where the skin is stretched over the cartilage. So I'm replicating those by taking my tortillon and just barely touching the paper, and it makes those really thin, defined lines, so it looks like the skin is actually kind of stretching. So it may be a little bit difficult to see on the camera, but it is showing up on my drawing. Just going to touch this area up just a little bit. And I'm going to go over this and then try and bring that highlight back a little bit. Didn't really like how that was blending together. So using my eraser, I'm going to just make really short kind of hatch line type marks with my eraser. So that looks a little bit better. And I'm just going to kind of push this darker shadow on the edge of the ear just a little bit. Okay, so I'm just going to put a little value right here, and then we'll work on that shadow behind the ear. So remember, you want to add the values around your facial feature that you're working with to help provide some context for the rest of the face. Okay, so I'm going to use my 6B pencil, and I'm just going to follow along, starting about here, almost at the very top of the ear. And I'm using the same technique that I did here, where I'm putting pressure, but I don't want to press too hard. I want it to be able to blend pretty easily when I use my tortillon in this spot. So this shadow and mark, I'm gonna bring about there, but I need to widen the shadow just a little bit. So just kind of look at the shadow and see where you don't see any texture. Like so on the rest of the head, you can see some little textures over in this area, but not so much here. It's pretty dark and black. So the shadow essentially is kind of replicating the outside shape of the ear, the outside line. And then there's a little bit of a shadow that pops up right here and kind of underneath and in front of the earlobe. Then there's kind of like a darker ridge right here in the bottom portion of the earlobe I'm going to add. Okay, so now I'm going to take my tortillon, use the same technique. I'm going to blend this in so it's nice and smooth. And then on the outer edge of the shadow, that's where it can start to kind of fade out. And you can use that stippling technique to get some of the textures on the skin. So this is where that shadow starts to kind of lessen up in terms of darkness. So you can even kind of use that stippling technique if you want. So doing that in some of these areas would get that texture of the skin that we see. So the last thing I'm gonna do the same thing that I did here and here. I just wanna define this a little more clearly, so I'm just going back in with my 6B pencil, kind of following that edge of the helix, that outside portion of the ear to kind of bring back that sharpness. And I can maybe kind of darken this outer portion of the helix just a little bit. Because as you can see in the photo, it is a little difficult to see where the shadow stops and where the edge of the ear is starting. So I'm just going to go over this to try and blend that in a little bit better, darken it up just a little. And using my tortillon, just very lightly go over it. Then I'm just going to define earlobe and the shadow that falls underneath it. And then, as I mentioned, I'm going to bring back some of the highlights on the earlobe. So there's kind of a brighter highlight right at the bottom, and then a little bit of a highlight here. And then, like this highlight's a little too sharp, so I can just kind of lightly go over it with my tortillon to make it blend into the rest of the ear a little more clearly. So right now, I'm just going through and touching up some really small things, maybe redefining some areas that need a little more definition or clarity. All right, so that is ear number two. When you finish your second page, upload it to Schoology.